tell you three stories about how research has affected policy. I'll tell you a success story, a happy story. I'll tell you a story of failure, so a sad story, and then I'll tell you a story that is going on now. And each of these stories has a counterpart in Brazil. So there are examples, these are examples of work that we have done in California to use research to affect policy, to improve policy, to create improvement in the education system here. And there are similar stories to tell in Brazil. And I think that some of the differences between California and Brazil are instructive. They can be useful to think about. So the first is a story about education finance. And before 2012, before 2012, California had the most complicated and the most state-centric, the most centralized education finance system in the United States. And there was a research project here at Stanford that was run by my colleagues at Pace that did an analysis of California's education policy system, or finance system. And there were 22 different studies that were done that looked at how much money California had for education, where the money came from, how it was it used effectively, what was its relationship to student outcomes, was it producing success for students. And you can imagine, first of all, you can imagine 22 researchers trying to look at a single problem, a very complicated study, but it came down to three main conclusions. Okay? And the first was that the system was too centralized, that we needed to give more responsibility to local decision makers, that the state capital should not be making decisions for local schools, that locals should have more authority, more responsibility themselves. Okay, that the money should go to the school districts and the schools that had the greatest needs, right? So that the poorest schools, the poorest students should receive more resources from the state. And it's important to recognize that before it was the opposite, right? That the state gave more money to the richest students for well, bad reasons. They were bad reasons. But not because they wanted to make the system more unequal, but just because that's the way it had worked. And the third was that the state should limit the number of rules in the system, that the state should stop telling local people what to do, but should leave them with more responsibility themselves. And in 2012, Jerry Brown, are you familiar with Jerry? Do you remember Jerry Brown, Governor Moonbeam? He was governor of California in the 1970s and then was re-elected governor in 2012. So he was 35 the first time and 75 the second time. But he was elected governor. And he looked at these studies, these studies that came from Stanford, from Pace, and he said, this is what we should do in California. This is these changes. And because he hired one of our colleagues here at Stanford, Michael Kirst, to be his Secretary of Education, to be in effect the State Secretary of Education. And together, they made the changes that the studies had called for. So this is an example. It's a very unusual example, but it's an example of a great policy success that originated in research, that originated at the university, that the university said, here are some good ideas. We think this would make California's education system better. And some politicians saw the studies, got access to the findings, and said, we agree. This would be better. And because the governor has power, researchers don't have power, universities don't have power, as you probably know. Because the governor has power, the governor was able to make these changes. And so California now, in 2015, is implementing a brand new system of education finance, much more decentralized, many fewer rules, and with the money going to the poorest districts and the poorest students. So it's just a radical transformation of California's education system that had its origins in research. Now, that almost never happens. So I tell you that story first because that's a really happy story, right? That's you know, from our point of view, this is why we do the work that we do, is because sometimes there are changes. So I said there were parallels. And in Brazil, when I was working in Brazil in the 1990s, I did quite a lot of work with IPEA and with a project that was called Fundescola, which was run by, the staff was mostly from IPEA, but it was run by the World Bank, Banco Mundial, and the BIRG, and the funding came from them. And they brought people like me to Brazil to do the kind of study that we did here at Stanford. And because Fernando Henrique Cardoso and his Secretary of Education, sort of were, well, I won't say why, but they ended up agreeing with us, that the ideas were good, that we should shift more money to the poorest states and to the poorest municipios, and we should, sort of reorganize the way that money flows through the system. They introduced the Fundeb, which I guess now is Fundefi, right? So a brand new system. So again, you see policy change, but the origin of the change was very different. Right? Brazilian universities, so far as I know, were not at all involved in this project. It was not academic research. It was contract research that had money from the World Bank behind it, and that's, the change came through a very different process. So, but you do see policy change. The change just happened for a different reason, without the engagement of universities. And, and one of the questions we might ask is, would it have looked different? Would we have seen a different policy outcome if the work had come from academics, from universities, rather than from the World Bank or from the Ministry of Education? Okay. The second story is something that I and PACE have been working on since I came to California, which is perhaps familiar to you, but the fragmentation of California's education system, that we have preschool education, we have K-12 education, we have community colleges, we have the California State Universities, we have the University of California, we have private universities, all of which are independent of one another. Okay, there is no ministry, there is no agency that governs all of these different institutions. The University of California is entirely independent from, it's in the Constitution, it's entirely independent from any governing body except its own board of trustees. The California community colleges are local colleges, so they are responsible to local boards of control. So there are 112 of them in California and 112 independent community colleges. The school districts are, again, they have local boards. They're locally controlled. There is a California Department of Education, but it can only influence them in very limited ways. And preschool is entirely separate from any of these other levels. So one of the things that we have been working on for years is how to bring these different institutions into closer alignment, to get them to work more closely together. And the place where we've concentrated is the move from basic education to post-secondary education. How can we make it easier for students to go to university? When they, when there's no connection between the school that they're attending and the university. And the instrument that we have worked with, that we have tried to use to make this happen, is the assessment system, is the tests that students take. And we have tried over the last now 7 years, 8 years, to get the universities and the colleges, the community colleges, the California states and the University of California, to agree on what does it mean for a student to be ready for college. You know, can we say what does it mean for a student to be prepared to come to college, so that they could go to a community college or to Cal State or to University of California? And the answer is they don't agree. You know, that for the community colleges, there are 112 of them. Each of them wants to decide for themselves what it means to be ready. The California state system is more centralized, more bureaucratized, so they actually have a standard definition. But their definition doesn't agree with the community colleges and doesn't agree with the University of California. So we've been working on this problem now for, well, as I say, 8 years. And it's just been a grand failure. Okay? That you know, the research is very clear that for example, we just published some reports on mathematics curriculum that, you know, students are prevented from going to university by the mathematics curriculum in different institutions. You know, that could change. That sort of changing the mathematics curriculum would make it easier for students to go to university, but there's no incentive for any of the institutions to change their behavior. So in one institution, you need to have taken, you know, 5 years of mathematics, and another one 3. The mathematics should look differently in the different institutions. And we have not found a way to make the research matter. We have not found a Governor Brown or a Fernando Henrique Cardoso who will make the change for us, because the power in the system is decentralized. It's not centralized. So we can't find a way to get the institutions to agree on what it means to be ready for college. So, and this is an example where Brazil is certainly ahead of California and really ahead of the United States with the ENADE and the ENEM. You know, there are at least some common standards about what it means to be ready for college and who gets to go to college. But, you know, and it's certainly better than the old vestibular system, which looks much more like what California looks like now, right? Where you have to apply to different institutions and the rules are different for each institution. But in Brazil, you know, with the introduction of the standardized assessments for students in secondary and post-secondary education, there's much more. There's now a point of leverage. There's now a place where it's possible to bring these institutions into closer alignment. Okay, and the third story that I want to tell you is one that's going on now. It's going on here, and it's going on in Brazil. And that is the Common Core in the United States, Base Nacional Comum in Brazil. And, you know, sort of what that means for basic education and for post-secondary education. You know, that introducing a common set of standards, a new set of standards, it can provide a common understanding of what students need to know, what they need to be able to do, both to graduate from high school, from basic education, but also to enter post-secondary education. And, you know, so in the United States, we have adopted the Common Core. We have agreed on what the new standards are. We're now faced with the problem of implementation, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But in Brazil, you know, you're now entering a moment where the Base Nacional Comum is going to be discussed. It's been released. There's now a period, I think, of 6 months or 6 weeks. 6 weeks until, you know, the draft will be revised, and then 6 months for public discussion. And, you know, and this is, at least in the United States, this is very important, both not just for basic education, but also for post-secondary education. You know, this is going to define for the next generation what students should know and be able to do, what kinds of students will come to your universities. And so, it's a topic that I'm curious to know how closely you're following it and whether it matters to you and whether this is something that you feel you can intervene in. The one thing I want to say, because I'm working with my colleagues here, with Pedro, with Felipe, with my colleagues in the center, and with the Lemon Foundation, because the standards themselves are important. Right? In other words, and the debate right now in Brazil is about what's in the standards. Are they high enough? Are they ambitious enough? Are they complete? Do they make sense in terms of what we want our students to be able to do? But the real challenge comes after we agree on the standards. The real challenge is a challenge of implementation. Is then, if we change the standards, then everything else has to change. Right? Then we have to change the curriculum, we have to change the textbooks, we have to change the preparation of teachers, we have to change the tests, the assessments, because we're teaching students new things, we have to measure new things. So simply changing the standards doesn't change anything at all, right? That it's what changes after that that's going to be most important. And we've been working on sort of laying out some of the things that must change if the standards are going to make a difference.